What's up, slackers? Welcome to Book Cheats. Today we're going to be talking about To Kill a Mockingbird, chapters 23 through 31. Some of you may be wondering why we're pushing through a lot of chapters, and in my next video I'll explain why. Let's get right into the chapters. So starting with chapter 23, the main points in this chapter are that Atticus comes home and he reacts to Mr. Ewell spitting in his face, and all he says is that he wished Mr. Ewell didn't chew tobacco. Scout in this chapter is worried about Tom's life, and Atticus explains that Tom had an appeal and he still had a really good chance of getting off scot-free. Atticus and Jem in this chapter get into a discussion about the court system and how to make things fair. And Atticus says that the state should require that there be at least 2 witnesses to any capital offense, or in other words, anytime someone's going to get the death penalty, there should be at least 2 witnesses, and it should never be one man's word against another. Atticus explains that it was a huge victory, that it took them several hours to decide what to do with Tom's life, because in the past, these type of cases were open and shut against black people. Atticus says that 11 of the 12 jury members were against Tom, and the only person who was for Tom was one of the Cunninghams, the very people who tried to kill Tom the night before. Scout, being super proud of the Cunninghams' change of heart, said that she wanted to invite Walter Cunningham over for dinner again, and Aunt Alexandria forbade Scout from inviting one of the Cunninghams over for dinner because she said they were trash. Scout is super pissed and she goes to her room, and Jem, to cheer her up, shows Scout that he was starting to grow some chest hair. While they're in the room, Jem and Scout start to discuss why certain people hate other people, and Jem suggests that that might be why Boo Radley never leaves his house, because he wants to stay out of the whole hate mess. Awesome, now let's get into chapter 24. The main points in this chapter include that Jem finds out that Dill can't swim, and so Jem takes Dill to the creek to teach him how to swim. They forbade Scout from coming because that day they were going to go nude, and Scout had to stay home for one of Aunt Alexandria's parties. Aunt Alexandria has her church group come to the house for tea, and Aunt Alexandria invites some of the neighbors to come over too. Aunt Alexandria has Scout dress up in a dress and join the portion where they sit down and have tea and discuss things. Mrs. Merriweather, the pastor's wife, starts to say some racist stuff, and Miss Mowdy sort of shuts her down with some snide comments. Atticus randomly shows up to the house while they're having this tea party.
Here's Johnny!
And interrupts the tea party, and he asks if Calpurnia can come with him. Atticus sneaks around the back of the house, and everybody in the family goes into the kitchen to find out the news, and Atticus tells everyone that Tom Robinson had been shot 17 times in jail. Atticus explains that Tom tried to escape and climb over the fence, and that Tom knew that he was going to die, but he was tired of being in the legal system, and he thought that he had no chance whatsoever, even though he really did. Atticus asks if Calpurnia can come with him to tell Helen Robinson, Tom's wife, about Tom's death. Atticus and Calpurnia leave to go tell Helen, and Aunt Alexandria is visibly upset. She knows how much this type of news weighs on Atticus, and Scout learns her first lesson about being a lady when Aunt Alexandria recovers from being upset and rejoins the party and acts like nothing happened. The next chapter, chapter 25, the main points include: we learn more about Jem's compassion as Scout is trying to squish a roly-poly, and Jem stops her from squishing the small insect. After this, Scout sort of flashes back to the day, leaving off from the last chapter, when Atticus and Calpurnia were driving down the road. And as Atticus and Calpurnia were driving down the road, they saw Jem and Dill walking back from swimming, and Jem and Dill convinced Atticus to take them with him to Helen Robinson's house. When Atticus got to her house and told Helen Robinson what had happened, Helen dropped to the ground, completely defeated by the news that her husband Tom Robinson had been killed. Word spreads around the town of Tom Robinson's death, and surprisingly, Mr. Underwood, the newspaper guy, writes defending Tom Robinson, even though everybody knew he hated black people. But he said that it was super wrong for people to kill handicaps in any circumstance. The next chapter, chapter 26, Scout learns about Hitler and what he was doing to the Jews in Germany. And Scout feels like what Hitler was doing to the Jews and being prejudiced against them was similar to how all the people in the town treated black people. Scout goes and confronts Jem and asks him about the correlation between black people and Hitler and how they didn't treat Tom right during the trial. And Jem's sensitive side comes out, and he tells Scout to never talk about the trial ever again. The next chapter, chapter 27, Bob Ewell finally gets a job for the first time, being motivated by the whole town talking about him, and loses it within a couple days for being too lazy. Scout said that he was the first person she had ever seen lose a government job for being too lazy. The next big thing that happens in this chapter is that Judge Taylor is chilling at his house, and somebody was sneaking around his house and cut one of his screens from his back door. Judge Taylor knew that it was Mr. Ewell because he had been rude to Mr. Ewell at the trial. The next big thing that happens in chapter 27 is that Helen Robinson has to walk several extra miles to avoid passing Mr. Ewell's house to go to work, because every time she would pass by his house, Mr. Ewell would harass her. Mr. Dees, Helen Robinson's employer, confronts Mr. Ewell and tells Mr. Ewell that if he keeps bugging Helen, that he'd throw him in jail. Mr. Dees even goes as far as to walk Helen Robinson home to show a show of force. After this, Halloween is coming around, and the town sponsors a play for the school children to act in, and Scout is given the role of a ham. When the day for the play comes around, Atticus and Aunt Alexandria are way too tired to go watch the play that Scout's supposed to be in for her school. And instead they have Scout act out her ham part in the front room, and they have Jem take her to the play. Chapter 28 leaves off where the last chapter left off, and Jem is walking Scout to school for the play, and as they're walking to school, Cecil Jacobs, one of their classmates, jumps out from one of the bushes and scares Scout and Jem. Scout and Cecil go backstage and get into their costumes. And as the play goes on, Mrs. Merriweather drones on for 30 minutes, and Scout starts to doze off, and she misses her part when she's supposed to come out. And after the play, Mrs. Merriweather blames Scout for ruining the entire play. Scout is super embarrassed for ruining the play, and she doesn't want to take off her costume so that she can hide her feelings of embarrassment. And Jem and Scout are one of the last to leave the school. As Jem and Scout are walking home, Scout realizes that she forgot her shoes, and Jem and Scout turn back to get her shoes. But as they turn back, all of the school lights turn off, and it was super dark outside. Jem and Scout decide to get her shoes the next day, and they continue onward home. And as they're walking through the dark, they hear something in the darkness following them. Jem and Scout thought that it was Cecil Jacobs again trying to scare them, but as they called out, and there was no response, Jem and Scout realized they were in trouble. Suddenly, adult footsteps started running towards them, and Jem yelled at Scout to run. The two of them started running, and Scout was grabbed from behind, and the person who grabbed her began to squeeze her aggressively, crushing her costume. Scout couldn't see anything that was going on, and she heard the person go after Jem, and after some struggle, she heard Jem let out a loud screech and fall to the ground in silence. The attacker turned and went after Scout again, and as this attacker began to squeeze Scout again, another person intervened, and there was a struggle, and suddenly Scout was free. And this person, who Scout couldn't really see, picked up Jem, and Scout slowly followed as they walked home. Atticus rushed outside, and they immediately called Dr. Reynolds, and Scout wasn't sure if Jem was dead or not. Dr. Reynolds chuckles and says that Jem wasn't dead, but that he had a broken arm and had a concussion. The sheriff comes next and tells Atticus that the attacker was Bob Ewell, and that he was dead on the ground with a kitchen knife in his ribs. After the excitement of chapter 28, chapter 29 is Sheriff Tate interviewing Scout about her testimony of the experience. As Scout is going through the story, Mr. Tate asks who was the person who had helped them, who picked up Jem and carried him home. Scout pointed in the corner at a man who looked really pale and super skinny, with rings around his eyes, and pointed at that person. And immediately after pointing at the person, Scout realized that the person who had saved them was Boo Radley. Scout ends the chapter by saying, "Hey Boo." The next chapter is chapter 30, and in chapter 30, Dr. Reynolds leaves, and Mr. Tate, Atticus, Scout, and Arthur or Boo Radley go outside to talk for a minute and work everything out. Scout has Boo Radley sit with her on the other side of the porch while Mr. Tate and Atticus argue out the details. Mr. Tate keeps insisting that Bob Ewell fell on his knife, and Atticus keeps insisting that Jem stole Bob Ewell's knife and stabbed him with it out of self-defense based on the testimony of what Scout said. Mr. Tate knows what really happened, how Arthur Radley had saved them and had stabbed Bob Ewell. And Mr. Tate is trying to protect Boo Radley from the public display, even though he would get off scot-free. Mr. Tate gets angry at the end of the chapter and spells it out plainly that Boo Radley was the one who stabbed Bob Ewell, and that he was trying to protect Boo Radley by saying that Bob Ewell killed himself. Atticus, finally realizing the heroic act of Boo Radley, gives in and tells Scout that Bob Ewell fell on his own knife, and Atticus goes over to Boo Radley, or Arthur Radley, and sincerely thanks him for saving his children. The final chapter of the book is chapter 31, and Scout takes Boo Radley into Jem's room to say goodbye, and Boo Radley asks if Scout can walk him home. Scout walks Arthur Radley home, and when they get to his front door, Boo Radley walks inside his house, and Scout says that she never saw him ever again. Scout stops in the front porch of Boo Radley and looks out on the street, and she imagines everything that had happened throughout the book as she was growing up, but from Boo Radley's perspective, looking out the window. And you sort of have a reminiscing moment about everything that had happened in the book, and then Scout goes home. When Scout gets home, she asks Atticus if she can stay up and listen to Atticus read, and Atticus reads one of Jem's scary books until Scout falls asleep, and that concludes the book. Thanks so much for your guys' support with Book Cheats. Thanks so much for watching all these videos, and also look out for the next video where I have a huge announcement for this channel. Thanks so much again for the support. You guys have an awesome day, and slack on.